Carrie. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, you are a pediatric speech language pathologist, an author, a speaker, and a mother of kids with disability. So, for all of those reasons, we are really grateful to have you here on this show. Would you just start by introducing us to you and your family?
Yeah. So thanks for having me here today. I am one of four. We have a family of four, and my husband's name is David. And then I have two boys. My older is 14, and he has a pseudonym in the book that I wrote. So we'll call him Pete. He's 14. He's an eighth grader, and he has dyslexia and ADHD. And my younger son, who we call Dan, is almost 13. He's a sixth grader, and he has multiple disabilities. He has a genetic condition that causes blindness and low bone density. And he has some pretty significant mental health challenges as well. We adopted him when he was 4.5, and he had an interesting start to life.
Mm,
And so that is our family.
great. Well, thank you. And I figure that they may come up as we speak to each other. You've written a book, which you mentioned, called Beyond Inclusion, which I really appreciated when I first read it, and I appreciated looking back through it just in preparation for this conversation. You give really practical tools for parents. Specifically, at least what I took out of it was ways to speak into some of the hard moments that we might experience with our kids with disabilities. And I thought we could begin by asking, or I could begin by asking you, what are some of the common misconceptions of disability that we encounter as parents? And how do those things actually affect our families?
Yeah. I mean, in researching for my book, I came across numerous forms but I narrowed it down to 15 in the book. I feel like almost all of them happen at some point, but there are a couple that I feel like happen pretty regularly.
Okay.
One of them, probably the one that happens the most frequently, especially if Dan is around because he has a visible disability,
Mm,
is the misconception that his private information is kind of up for anyone who wants it.
hmm.
So pretty much always someone will ask about his blindness one way or the other. Is he blind? That's usually where it starts, and then it might go on to, has he ever been able to see? Does he see anything? How did he become blind? And he doesn't like it. I think he wants to be in control of his own story. If it's going to be talked about, it's going to be his
Yeah.
initiative. And
Yeah.
so that it has flabbergasted me how often that happens, because we can't go anywhere outside in our little small community of people that are close to us. It never comes up, obviously. But if we step outside of that little community, it is almost something that we can guarantee will happen if we're out at a store or at a park or somewhere. So that surprised me how often that has
Yeah.
happened. And then the other one is that if I just am casually chatting with someone and his disability comes up, it's the disability as a tragedy, where I get a sad face and I get a, oh, or, oh, that must be so hard. And so that's another misconception that kind of tends to show up pretty regularly.
Well, can we like maybe hone in on those two examples? How do you respond? And obviously, it's a little bit case by case and situation by situation.
Yep.
But to take that first example, which we've also experienced, I'm hearing from you both the lack of understanding that Dan's story is his story,
Mhm.
but also the talking about Dan with Dan present instead of talking to Dan.
Mhm.
Uh, I would imagine both of those things can kind of go a little haywire.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm curious how you handle that both in the public space and also with Dan, just as his mom, and maybe outside of that public space.
Yeah, those are happening all at different times. Dan and I are often having conversations at home away from the situation about
Yeah.
this very situation because it is triggering for him. And so he and I have had to have conversations about, okay, this will happen. We know the
Mhm.
only way to avoid this happening is us never going anywhere.
Yeah.
So we know that it could happen anytime, anywhere. We don't know when it's going to happen. So we
Mhm.
need to come up with a plan for when it does happen, what should we do? And I
Mhm.
want to honor his wishes. So I've told him that I won't share anything that's his personal information unless he wants me to. But then he and I have to negotiate a little bit about me just providing an answer and education about blindness in general. because sometimes the people that are asking are people who are wanting to learn. And we know that there's two sides to the coin, right? There's people, if you don't know, then you might need to ask to get information. But then the asking can feel problematic. And so um, he and I have come up with a plan where in the moment, I will say, do you want to be here for this? Or would you like to go find somewhere else to sit while I talk to this
Mm,
person?
okay.
Where I've told him when I'm talking to them, I'll just be talking about general blindness. I'm not going to be sharing your details.
Mm,
And then he gets to decide if he wants to step away and do
yeah.
something else or if he wants to be a part of the conversation. Usually he chooses to do something else because he just doesn't really care to talk about it. And I think that he feels like there's a vulnerability there. I think it's also he's almost 13. And I've
Yeah.
heard from other people that this age, especially, sometimes can be a time where it's even that adds a layer of difficulty to the situation.
I think that given I have a 14-year-old and having just been in a 13-year-old space, and she's typically developing, but
Mhm,
cannot imagine
mhm.
how she would respond to people in her presence asking me questions about her hair. I mean, questions about
Me
anything, like, it would
Yeah,
just be really, really painful and hard. So I appreciate that so much. How
yeah.
about the tragedy piece? Could you speak to that for a minute in terms
What?
of that tragedy, like disability
Oh,
as tragedy? Like, how does
yes.
that come up and how do you handle it?
Well, when there are little kids around, it can happen even when Dan's around, but a lot of times when it happens is when he's not around, thankfully.
Okay.
Someone might go, "Oh, that's sad." And I'd say,
Mhm.
"Actually, it's not sad. This is blindness. This is how he is, and we love him the way he is." And just something really basic like that, and then
Yeah.
just kind of trying to move on from it.
Yeah.
Try to
Yeah.
keep it simple and not too emotionally charged. Um, Very matter of fact, and then just kind of let him sit
Yeah.
with that
I
idea.
appreciate that, and I like the idea of almost preparing an answer ahead of time. The fact that, because of the age he is, him being a part of that preparation even, and that sense of like, yeah, I wish that were never said at all, but if it is, let's have a response that contains the problem rather than kind of allowing it to, fester, it sounds like to me.
Yes.
The other piece of what you wrote about in your book that I wanted to make sure to talk about was the presumption of incompetence.
Mhm.
And I thought I might ask you just to spell out what that is, the presumption of
Yeah.
incompetence, but also, and this may not, I don't know if this still happens for you with Dan. I know it did when he was younger, but can you talk again about how that's kind of played out in your life? We've certainly and continue to see
Yes.
that with our daughter Penny, who is 19 and has
Mhm.
Down syndrome and is quite competent in many ways, but the presumption of incompetence is
Yeah.
present a lot of the time.
Yes, it runs deep. The presumption of incompetence basically is this idea that people carry that if someone has a disability, if they're disabled, that they are incompetent just because of disability. So the interesting thing about it is that it's not, and this is what really gets to the crux of it, that it is not something that has been given any conscious thought. It's a misconception that's just part of our culture because, sometimes people will presume incompetence about a disabled person that has nothing to do with their actual disability. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
people who use a wheelchair, people might speak loudly to them, like, and if they were to stop and think about it, they would go, well, these things that doesn't make sense. But making sense isn't actually a part of some of these ableist notions. There isn't really any sense to it. It's just kind of something that is out there
mm,
that is just kind of coming from all directions. You crack the door open a little bit where people start to pick apart and go, wait a second, that actually might not be true. So it does come up with Dan. I think sometimes it's because he's blind, it's almost like people need to just run around and do everything for him. And so I have to sometimes just kind of butt in and go, oh, hold on a sec. He actually can do that. The interesting thing, this goes along with disabled people being their own individuals with their own stories and preferences. Dan actually doesn't care if people think he's incompetent because he
mm,
loves when people do things for him. That's part of his story. So that's
interesting.
another layer that I have to balance. There is like some autonomy in that for him and sometimes letting him get away with letting people cater to him and do things for him that he can do himself. But also then calling it out sometimes when it's problematic. Like for example,
Yeah.
certain environments where the people that he is surrounded by need to know that he can do X, Y, and Z. So it can be kind of a tricky thing to balance, and it kind of, depending on the person, they'll all have their own feelings about it and their own reactions to it. Dan doesn't really do anything to try to prove to prove his competence, but um I think the other extreme of that is that people will spend a lot of time and energy trying to prove their competence and their worth when they shouldn't have to. That a lot of disabled people feel inclined to work harder, to never make mistakes, to show
Mhm.
up as like
Agree.
the best person, the best ambassador, the best, you know, disabled person you ever did meet so that I can be a representative for the whole community and make everyone know that we are worthy. And that's not really fair. So it the presumption of incompetence comes loaded, and it can like manifest in different ways, and it can also like affect people in different ways and shape their trajectories and kind of how they show up in the world too.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because I think our typically developing kids, there's probably more presumption of competence sometimes than there should be, in the
Yeah.
sense that all of us as humans have competencies
Yes.
and needs, and it's almost like this imbalanced understanding of each of our humanity in the way that we assume things about one another, and how hard it sometimes can be to even express like our need for something in a social situation, especially with someone who doesn't know us. And I would think, especially with Pete, with your older son, in terms of having kind of invisible disabilities, the opposite might sometimes be
Oh,
true.
yes.
As
Yeah,
again, it sometimes is with me, you know.
exactly. Yeah, that definitely was a thing for him, that like when we were first trying to figure out what was going on with him, he was presumed more competent than he was, and
Yeah,
therefore then there were other stories then that he was telling himself, and that other people were inadvertently telling him, like that he just wasn't trying hard enough, that we weren't making him read enough at home, that he wasn't practicing enough. Lots of things, that reasons why he wasn't rising to the challenge, that were actually going toward the side of we're expecting too much, like we're
yeah,
presuming too much competence. And I think you're right, that happens a lot, like because we tend to want to lump people into groups, and we don't want to individualize things like we should.
yeah.
uh, Individualization would show us all this variability with competence in all these different areas, that would be just, each individual has their own strengths and their own challenges, but because we like to separate things and keep them neat and tidy, we either presume overcompetence or we presume that there's incompetence. So yeah, that is a really good point, and it is interesting how it has worked itself out in our family.
One of the things in your book that I also really loved is you just wrote about including disability as a normal part of our children's play. And I wanted to ask you what that might look like and why it might matter, again, both for typically developing kids and for kids with disabilities.
Yeah. So I have the best example I can give right now, and that gives me so much hope, is we have neighbors that live across the street from us, and they have a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I've had the chance to go over and like babysit for them from time to time. Or one day I just went over to play with the 5-year-old because she wanted me to come play with her for an hour. And I was
Yay.
like, of course. They have toys and books in their kids. Neither one of their kids have a disability. They have toys and books in their kids' collections that represent disability.
Hmm.
And like what she has, my little neighbor has a doll that has a disability. And so I was very curious to kind of see her doll's role in the play. I was just curious. So I just left it open to see. And the doll's an auntie, and she has a name and she has a backstory, and her disability wasn't even part of the story.
Hmm.
And that's a triumph, not because it's that we want to avoid talking about disability. It's not that disability is something shameful to be talked about, but disability becomes the center of a person's identity sometimes, whether they want to or not, right? So a lot of times, if disability is not properly represented, and then you do have, like a toy, or when a company releases a new toy that has a disabled character, it's a whole thing that's like, oh
Yeah,
my gosh, look at this. And it's great that they're making these toys. I don't
right.
want to like minimize that. But it's also great to just make toys that represent disability, and that we don't have to have it doesn't have to be a grand unveiling. Like, it's important to people who are disabled to see themselves represented,
Right.
but it also we can then go on and have plenty of those toys, and people can buy those toys for their non-disabled kids, so that when the kids are playing, it's a community of toys that are disabled and non-disabled.
Right.
And so, even the little neighbor's baby books, I was looking at his books, and one of his books was a book called Baby Faces. And the baby on the cover had Down syndrome
Hmm.
and wasn't mentioned. You know what I mean? This book was not a disability. This was a baby face
Mm.
among faces in a community of faces. And that's what I think we need to try to get to, that it doesn't have to be disabled, non-disabled, that like if we include disabled, non-disabled toys, play, books, then disability starts to just become part of it has its place as a normal part of the human condition and not this separate category,
Right.
So, but with my own kids, like this was before this was on my radar with Pete when he was like 3 or 4. He had a Power Ranger toy that the bottom half of one of its legs were missing. And we, were looking for it. We couldn't find it. And so then it was like, well, what are we going to do?
Mm.
And and I don't know if it was a conscious decision or not, but we found something that would work and we made him a prosthetic. And then that gave me the opportunity to
Yeah.
tell Pete about prosthetic limbs and about all the things that people who use them, what they can do, and that they can do all the things and that they're Olympic athletes. And so then now that's definitely like if the toys, you know, have something different about them, it's kind of a little bit bigger of a thing that we can talk about. But I love the fact that stores are just selling toys now because that's much more intentional.
Right.
and and I love that it's so much easier to find them now. It's gradually getting easier and easier, I think. So
Yeah, I don't think when my kids, who are now all teenagers, were younger, there was that type of representation. And so for me, it was trying to use, and I still do this too, but like language that would normalize and kind
yeah,
of neutralize disability. But to have for especially for young kids, to have the physical manifestations of that normality and neutral experience of humanity seems like it's really, really important and positive.
yeah,
Other thing I wanted to ask you about was mistakes. People are going to make mistakes when talking about disability, when asking questions. And we might do that as parents. I'm sure there are plenty of parents listening to this podcast who are like, yeah, I've kind of done what some of the things you just said, whether that's about my own child or about someone
yes,
else's. And I think we all sometimes feel like we're just fumbling through these spaces where we want to have real connections with
yes,
families and people, and we're really afraid of making mistakes. So, how do
yes.
you handle those mistakes? And what kind of encouragement might you make for some of us who are like, "Oh gosh, that's me." I don't use the right language all the time, or I don't, and I'm afraid of getting it wrong.
Yeah. I mean, that's also me. One thing I want to make sure I explicitly say is like I think there's like an ongoing quest to do right and to like get things right. And that the reason we want to do that, I think deep down is because we don't want to hurt people. Like that's what's at the core of why we
Yeah.
want to get it right is that we don't choose to be hurtful. And so that quest is, part of it is you grow and you learn and you stick your neck out and you try something and maybe you get it wrong. But I've been lucky enough to be in some spaces that have taught me how to acknowledge that I made a mistake. And just saying it. That's the hardest part sometimes is just saying, "Oh, I messed up. I didn't word that the way I wanted to, or I think I said that in a way that might have been hurtful. Um, I am so sorry if I hurt you." And then the next piece of that is I'd like to figure out how to do better. And so I think when we are talking to people, if they happen to get it wrong or make a mistake, I think we can gently say, actually, and just very non confrontationally, very respectfully give a little bit of information. And then even just saying, if you're interested in learning more, and then maybe offer a resource, one of your favorite resources.
Mhm.
I have my favorite resource that I wrote myself, that I tell people, "Hey, I wrote this book." And the whole
Yeah.
reason I wrote it is because I know so many people in our life that would explicitly ask me and say, "I want to make sure to get this right for him,
Yeah.
but how do I do that?" And
Right.
so I know that it's something that people want. And so you can offer a resource, and then if they'll do with it what they'll do with it, because what they do with it is not up to us. They'll either choose to look into it because they want to learn, or it was maybe just more of a social, I'm going to apologize because I think I got it wrong, but I don't really actually care that much, because that's true too sometimes,
Right.
right? I think all we can do is, you know, mention it. I especially am motivated to mention it if my kids are around, because I don't like the idea of certain things hanging out there anyways, but especially if my kids are there, I
Yeah.
want them to know, nope, that's not true, but also one more thing I sometimes like to do is say something like, "That's a really common misconception,
Mhm.
you're not alone. You're not alone in
Yeah.
thinking that." A lot of people think that, but actually, this is what the truth is. If you're interested in learning more, here's this resource, or let me know. Maybe we could chat more sometime. Just kind of opening it up, offering a resource, and then kind of the ball's in their court.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really, really helpful. I was talking with a young mom of a baby with Down syndrome, and she was saying that she had many encounters where people were referring to her child as a Downs baby. And she
Hmm.
said, "Do I correct them? Like, I've only just learned this language myself to say baby with Down
Yes.
syndrome, but it still kind of hurts my heart every time I hear it." And I said, kind of similar to you, you might just want to like rehearse some lines behind the scenes so that it's not quite so emotionally fraught, and so that you can gently say, one thing I've learned in the few months that I have been a mom to this
Yeah.
child is this type of language. If that's something you're able to incorporate when talking about her, I'd really appreciate it. Like, just
Yes.
trying to think, how would I want to be on the receiving end of
Yes.
those types of messages? And, can I practice that? So that kind of brings me back. I want to sum up some of the things that you have said that I think are so helpful and actionable for us. I wrote some down. The first was just to come up with a plan when we're outside of those interactions with the other people who are maybe asking questions about us or our families or our kids. And then I also loved your thoughts of like talking in general rather than sharing kind of private details about our
Mhm.
children.
Mhm.
So I can talk about Down syndrome without having to kind of betray Penny's privacy, which I think is a really helpful idea. And then you also mentioned presuming competence, and we talked about presuming need. That there's just a way of kind of assuming some things as we go into the world, and then including disability as a normal part of play, of conversation, of our human lives. Those are all some things that I wrote down from what you just had to say. Is there
Yeah.
anything you would like to add, just as a sum up for some parents who might be looking for ways to take this conversation out into their everyday life?
I think the only last thing I'd like to say is some of the best thing that we can do is just to love on our kids out in the open,
Mhm.
love on them, um, and delight in them, and creating in our own families what we wish was out there in the world, so that
Yeah,
at least our kids know that it's possible, and that when we live like that and we name the things that happen out there, or the misconceptions that are out there, and we talk about it with our kids, then our kids will be able to recognize when it happens. Our kids will go, "That's actually not true."
yeah,
Because that's important for our kids to know that misconception is not true, so that it doesn't get too far in there. We can't control the fact that sometimes it will, but by naming it, calling it out, we can make sure that at least they won't hear it and internalize it any more than what we actually have influence over. So,
yeah. Yeah, we want their foundation to be one of belovedness and delight, and they may not get that every time they step out the door, but if they have that as a foundation from the home, it can go a long way.
yes.
Thank you again for being with us. I'm so glad we got to learn from you.
Yeah. Thanks so much.